Good morning, I'm Jonathan Shannon, and welcome to the debut of the Citizen Report. On each episode of the Citizen Report, we will take a look at news and current events with a citizen's point of view. This week, the Citizen Report has learned about a new report on meat products and what is in them, or really, what is in them but should not be. In the just-released October 2018 Consumer Reports magazine, the report reveals a number of banned drugs that were in meat products, like poultry, beef, pork, etc. For example, phenylbutazone is an anti-inflammatory pain drug. It was deemed too dangerous for humans, and although officially banned in poultry, beef, and pork products, it, in fact, was detected in the case study. Well, I want to get some answers on this, so my next guest is an expert in the field of animal science who taught at college for a number of years. He is actually my dad. So joining me now to discuss this in detail is Dr. David Shannon. Dad, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So could you just give us some general background about this?
Okay, the federal government has always been interested in the quality of the food we eat. There's two main parts of government that have responsibilities in the area of food safety. The first is the FDA. It was created in 1848. The second is the USDA. It was created in 1862. Within the USDA is an agency called the FSIS. That's the one that's mentioned in this particular article. It was established in 1977. Related to this are the laws and regulations that have developed over time to ensure that our food is safe. One of those laws is the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act of 1938. Now, there was an amendment to that in 1958 where they added the so-called Delaney Clause, or as it was described in the classes I took in college, the Delaney Amendment. And that basically said if a chemical causes cancer, it cannot be in food at any level or any amount. And it, in practice, applied to additives that were added after 1958. Well, over time, measuring technology has improved and continues to improve. At the time of the Delaney Clause, when it was first in place, they could measure down to 1 part per billion, 1 part per million, and anything less than 1 part per million was considered safe at that time. We can now measure in parts per billion, and the technology will continue to improve in the future. And that's what this article is about. In the article itself, they talk about numbers that are very small, but these chemicals are there, and they're arguing basically that the standards should be lowered or made to be a lower number, a more stringent requirement.
So for those who aren't necessarily well-versed in the scientific field, can you just explain to me what the difference is between parts per million and parts per billion, just so that the audience understands that?
Well, you can take a 1 and put a comma, and it's the number of zeros after it. And if you divided that up if you took a pie and divided it up into tiny little slices, you're talking about real small numbers.
So in a visual sense, or in another visual sense then, basically when you're talking about parts per million, you're basically looking at it from a little bit further away, whereas parts per billion, you're looking at things in a microscopic sense, even closer than that parts per million. Then you're able to see closer in than you were even able to at the million point.
It's basically taking a needle and putting it in a haystack versus taking a needle and putting it in a larger haystack.
I see. Okay. So how are these drugs then getting into meat products?
There's a number of ways that they can do that. Some are relatively benign, some are quite deliberate. In the cases of all the drugs, they come from somewhere, And in most cases, they basically are natural things that the pharmaceutical companies have found a way to concentrate. Some of the drugs come from soil and a contamination of soil that somehow gets into the animal and gets into its bloodstream, and from that into the meat could explain it. There might be something in the feed that shouldn't have been there. Or another likely example is someone has an animal that's a little bit under the weather. They call the vet in, and the vet and the producer have a conversation about what they're going to do with the animal, and the vet gives a vaccination with the idea that the animal's going to stay on the farm. But then the farmer decides, no, I think I better take it to the auction. And because there's not enough time for the animal's body to clear the chemical out of the body, it's there when it shouldn't be there.
So basically, when, in the case of the veterinarian injecting this vaccine into the animal, they're giving them they could be giving them the drug that actually is not even legal to begin with.
Well, I'm not saying that necessarily, that these drugs that they mention in this particular article shouldn't be in these particular animals. That's true. I'm just talking about contaminations in general.
Okay. So if these drugs are banned, then why are they showing up at even small levels? And in just a general sense, why are they showing up even in just a microscopic level?
Well, in most cases, if they're banned for very specific things. In the little run-up to talk about all this, I talked about laws and regulations. And laws and regulations are very specific. So very few things are just outright banned. They're banned for this particular animal for this particular purpose. And
let me stop you right there, because that's kind of interesting. So you're saying that in certain situations or conditions, this drug could be per se legal, but in the context of the animal entering the food supply, shall we say, it's banned, but in other uses it may not necessarily be banned.
That's correct. I'm not a veterinarian. I'm not looking at it from that perspective, but that's true.
Okay. So obviously this has been going on for a while now, but why are we just now learning about this, would you say?
Well, in terms of this article was written by someone that in the past worked for the government, and they're basically trying to argue or present an argument to lower the standard. And when I say lower the standard, I mean take the number from the present number that it is to a lower number. And so they're setting up a more stringent situation.
So why are we just if we're talking about these drugs, and we're only, for example, at the beginning of the show I mentioned phenylbutazone, which is an anti-inflammatory pain drug deemed too dangerous for humans and banned in these variety of animals that enter the food supply. But is it possible that not just the drugs in this case study, but that other drugs could end up entering these animals and therefore possibly the food supply?
Yes, it is. But in general, the food supply is very secure. And we're talking about things in very small quantities. The only reason we're talking about it is because we can now measure in parts per billion. If we go back a few years in time and change the technology a little bit, we can't even see these in any kind of test that can be done. They can take dozens of compounds and measure chemicals that are found in the blood or in the meat from a sample, but they have to have some reason to look for it. There is a cost associated with it, so they can't look for everything in the world that might be in there. They have to have some targeted idea of what might be in the food stream and some reason to look for it.
So for the average consumer like myself, are there any precautions that I or any consumer could take to prevent these kind of things from getting into my system?
Well, just eat healthy foods, and
By that you mean just taking normal precautions like cooking the food thoroughly, making sure they're of appropriate temperatures, things like that.
the risk from these chemicals, and again, I'm not a physician and I'm not a veterinarian, so I'm not looking at it from that perspective, but the risk from most foods is diseases associated with animals, and good cooking practice will take care of that. So if you cook your food well, then you're probably going to be all right.
Okay, so, and of course, we're talking about if changes are to be made, then it would have to come from the government itself, and specifically the federal government. What agency, I think you might have mentioned it before, but what federal agency is charged with the task of regulating this kind of stuff?
Well, again, all food is looked at from either the perspective of the FDA or the USDA, and meats are the area that the USDA has control over in most cases.
And then what kind of changes would you say could be made to possibly remedy this in the future?
Well, they will continue to monitor. When an animal is sold at auction, for example, they draw blood from it and they run samples on it. And when the meat from an animal is going through processing, they have a pretty good idea, even before they've done almost any of the high technology things, how healthy the animal is. And they can target with these samples that we've been talking about dozens of compounds very easily, and ensure that our food supply is safe.
Okay, we're running out of time, but very quickly, could you just explain, would changes that you've just described, could they come without an act of Congress, or is this something that could be enacted within the bureaucracy of these agencies in the federal government?
Well, in this particular article, and they don't show everything, but it appears from their graph, they're talking about the difference on these 4 different chemicals that they talk about, the difference between 1 part per billion and 3 parts per billion. And the Consumer Reports is arguing that they want the standard to be at 1 part per billion, and the FSIS uses 3 parts per billion. Now, which is appropriate? I don't know. The standard has to be somewhere between the levels they can't measure and the levels they can accurately measure.
Well, we're going to have to leave it right there, but Dad, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure.
And that was my dad, Dr. David Shannon, who holds a PhD in animal science from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Well, that's it from us this week. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great week ahead.